You know, John Shoven needs no introduction in this room, but in the interest of fairness, I'm going to give him one. So, John is the former Trioni director of CEPR and was the Charles R. Schwab Professor of Economics before becoming emeritus in 2019. But anyone who knows John knows that retirement takes on a very different meaning for him, and will not be surprised to hear that as an emeritus professor, he's developed a new course on financial literacy with Michael Boskin. He's continued organizing annual conferences on working longer, and he has added to his collection of over 100 professional articles during this time. So I just want to highlight a few things that John has worked on that is very relevant for today's event. He is the author of a 1999 book with Syl Schieber entitled The Real Deal, The History and Future of Social Security. And that book outlines a comprehensive proposal to reform Social Security. And he also wrote an influential 2004 paper in the American Economic Review with Robert Posen and Syl Schieber that introduced progressive price indexing. Finally, he also wrote a book with former Secretary of State and Treasury, George P. Shultz, entitled Putting Our House in Order, A Guide to Social Security and Healthcare Reform. Among John's many achievements, I credit him with teaching me basically everything I know about the topic as my PhD advisor. So with that, I will bring John to the stage, and he will introduce the panelists for the next session. So thanks, John.
Well, I must say I'm very proud to have Gopi as my student, and she didn't mention that she was a co-author of the book that I did with George Shultz, and that was a kind of amazing experience. I've been thinking about Social Security and working on Social Security for more than 40 years, so I predate the Greenspan Commission, and so that was 40 years ago, and as Gopi mentioned, we had this book that Syl Schieber and I did. It was written about 25 years ago, and it has the unassuming subtitle of The History and Future of Social Security. By then, the kind of trust fund problem that we're talking about today had been known for a decade. So the fact that the system was not going to be in balance has been known for 35 years. And so it's really kind of beyond disappointing to me that we haven't addressed the problem, having known about it for 35 years. And as you may know, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has a set of principles that they think apply to Social Security reform, and their number one principle is fix it sooner rather than later. I think they should modify their expression and say, fix it late rather than later, because it should have been fixed a long time ago. Now, I wasn't able to be here this morning, so I don't quite know what you said about the 1983 reforms, but I was just going to mention a couple of things that might be relevant. One is, those reforms, the Greenspan reforms, were done at the very last minute. Literally, the checks were going to be delayed within about 3 months of the enactment of the Greenspan Commission. In other words, they were right against the deadline. And that also could have been seen several years earlier, but it wasn't. Second thing I would say is that was a truly bipartisan effort. I listened to what Peter had to say about whether it's possible today. I was just going to remember a couple of things that happened. You know, Reagan gets elected, and David Stockman is his kind of special assistant, boy genius, or whatever he was supposed to be, and they came up with a Social Security reform proposal that involved some immediate cuts, particularly for early retirees, and they sent their bill to the Senate. And the vote on that bill was 1 in favor, 99 against. So even Senator Dole, who was the the Speaker, the head of the Senate for the Republican side voted against it. So Reagan kind of had his head handed to him, and so did David Stockman. Their proposal was completely dead on arrival. Reagan had the sensible idea that, well, this is really tough, and I'm going to try to get reelected in 1984, so it's time for a compromise, a political compromise. Let's work on this together. And so he went to Speaker Tip O'Neill and said, we need a bipartisan commission, and here's the deal. You appoint 7 members, and I'll appoint 7 members. And so that was kind of the deal. And then Reagan, and I don't know, I'm not claiming that Reagan was a genius or anything, but he did have a good idea. The next day, he announced his 7 appointments, and it was 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. And it put tremendous pressure on Tip O'Neill to be equally bipartisan in his picks, and I think that had a lot to do with the success of that venture, that it truly was bipartisan. So, by the way, they also agreed within the commission on the size of the problem. Before that, the Republicans were saying, benefits need to be cut, it's going to be a disaster, and the Democrats were saying, oh, the benefits are going to be fine, but maybe we need a tax increase. But they kind of agreed on the size of the problem, which was the starting point for those negotiations. So I think, despite the fact that we're here today, the Greenspan Commission was a tremendous success. And Social Security was literally going to be in dire trouble within 3 months, and here we are 40 years later, and it's getting to be in dire trouble, but they lengthened the life considerably. Okay, I'm not on this panel, so I'm going to introduce the speakers. So we have 2 great speakers, both of whom are PhDs in economics, both of whom know their way around Washington. So actually, Debra Whitman, if you'd come up, and Andrew Biggs, if you'd come up, I'll introduce you, and then I'm going to have each of them talk for about 8 minutes. Then I'll ask them a couple of questions, and then you'll ask them some questions. Now, I think Deb, as she's known, she's the Executive Vice President and Chief Public Policy Officer of AARP, the American Association for Retired People, which looks after the interest of people 50 and over. And I must say, I've always thought that the entry age of 50 seemed a little young, but that's what the AARP does. Before her current job at AARP, she was a staff economist for the Senate Special Committee on Aging. And even before that, she worked for the Congressional Research Service on topics such as Social Security reform and aging and the like. In these roles, she's worked across the aisle with members of Congress and probably is a good observer of what is politically feasible. And I'm going to keep these introductions short, but I had to note that she is a Zag. She's a graduate of Gonzaga. Those of you who follow basketball, I know Gopi immediately recognized what I was talking about. And then she is her PhD from Syracuse, where her advisor was Doug Holtz-Egan. Okay, Andrew Biggs. He's equally impressive for us in this role. He is a senior fellow of the American Enterprise Institute. Importantly, he is a senior policy fellow here at CPR, should mention that. And he works on Social Security reform and also on state and local pension issues, of which there are a lot, as you may know. Andrew is a former principal deputy director of Social Security. So he's been there and done that. He also was the associate director of the President's National Economic Council, under President George W. Bush. And like Deb, he knows his way around Washington, which is kind of relevant to this. And his PhD is from LSE. So I think what I'm going to do is ask Deb, if you want, you can go first. Whoever you guys want to go first. But they're each going to give talks. You can do it sitting there, or you can come up here. And then I'll ask a couple of questions, and then you guys can ask questions.
I'll start out.
Okay.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. I should make a correction to one thing you said, John. You said I've been there and done that. The reality is I've been there and not done that, which is how we all end up here. But thank you all. Since we're in California, I'm going to open with some words from the state's greatest philosophers. That would be the Eagles. I am not going to say you can check out anytime you want. You can never leave. That would be lame, even by my low standards. But in their song Already Gone, which I think is an underappreciated rocker, the Eagles tell us, quote, often, I need to get my gravitas here, oftentimes it happens that we live our lives in chains and we never even know we hold the key. And in 1974 California, that was considered to be very deep. But it has something to say to us today. 40 years after we last successfully reformed Social Security, 38 years after Social Security once again slipped into deficits, 30 years since the Social Security trustees declared that, quote, action should be taken to strengthen financing of the OASDI system. In other words, we've known for more than a generation the challenges we face in fixing the federal government's largest program, the largest tax that most workers pay, and the greatest source of income for most retirees. And since then, drum roll please, nothing. Despite efforts from President Clinton and Bush, precisely nothing has been done to address Social Security's growing funding shortfall. The question is why nothing? And how do we get to a future, and hopefully a near future, that contains something other than nothing? Why is Social Security so hard to fix when so many other countries that face the same demographic challenges we do have managed to reform their pension systems? My answer is our discussions of Social Security and Social Security reform have been unduly constrained. We work inside a box that restrains Social Security in ways that have very little to do with what, in the abstract, we want a government retirement program to accomplish. As a result, we're left with an increasingly expensive program that pays high benefits to retirees who really don't need them, while providing inadequate protections to poor retirees who do. And I don't see things as much better today. In one sense, Republicans and Democrats have never been more united on Social Security. The two leading presidential candidates, current President Biden and former President Trump, have both pledged not to cut a penny from Social Security benefits. But neither Biden nor Trump have specified the tax increases needed to keep their promises. More worryingly, President Biden has constrained his choice at no benefit cuts and no payroll tax increases on people earning less than $400,000, that it's literally almost impossible to imagine a reform plan that is consistent with them. Keeping Social Security solvent only by raising payroll taxes and earnings over $400,000 requires a tax rate of over 23% on those earnings. So good luck with that. Trump, for his part, I'm not even going to go there. I've only got a little time. But a package made up of the conventional provisions we talk about that would achieve 75-year solvency would have to increase the retirement age, cut benefits for the top half of retirees, reduce cost of living adjustments, raise the payroll tax ceiling to $300,000, and increase the payroll tax rate by a point or so. Any one of those today is a deal killer. So since the failure of the George W. Bush reforms in 2005, I've started to think differently about Social Security reform, or think differently about how I think about Social Security reform. Bush's reforms, and nearly all conventional reforms, start with the current tax and benefit formulas and tweak them in various technical ways to eventually bring costs and revenues back into balance. The goal is to maintain the program as a program, not to achieve the program's goals. I've thought about it from the other direction. Start with what we want Social Security to accomplish, then build a plan to get there. Imagine a person age 21 who hasn't yet entered the workforce. They haven't paid a penny into Social Security, nor are they owed a penny by the program. That person will not retire for another 45 years. We can give them any kind of Social Security program we want. More specifically, we can design a program that reflects our current judgments on what a social insurance program in the 21st century should look like, not early 20th century judgments on a retirement system for the early 20th century. The wonky stuff is designing the transition rules to get from here to there, which actually isn't very hard. That doesn't eliminate the problem of dealing with currently accrued benefits that we lack the resources to pay for, but it gives an easily understandable and defensible endpoint to reform. So if we were inventing a Social Security program for the 21st century from scratch for that 21-year-old, what would it look like? If we're being honest, my guess is precisely like the current program wouldn't be the answer. Here's what I would do. The general case for a government retirement program will be first, protect against destitution in old age, however you want to define destitution. A variety of risks, whether they be low lifetime earnings, health shocks, death of a spouse, or divorce, can lead to destitution in old age. We're a rich country, and protecting against poverty is actually cheap. If Social Security simply paid every retiree a poverty level benefit, thereby taking elderly poverty to zero, costs will be cut roughly in half. If you paid a means-tested benefit, where you're effectively just filling the poverty gap, the program would be even cheaper. That's what countries like Australia and New Zealand already do. Second, a public retirement system can protect against moral hazard and myopia by requiring everyone to save for retirement. Currently, we do that through Social Security. For instance, my wife and I will together collect about $80,000 a year in Social Security benefits when we retire. That's about 4 times the elderly poverty threshold, far above what any safety net program would provide. While protecting against poverty is cheap, providing 4 times the poverty line to millions of upper income households isn't. The maximum Social Security benefit today this year tops $43,000 for one retiree. That's 2 to 3 times higher than the maximum benefits paid in the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, or New Zealand. But there's another way to require people to save for retirement, which is, well, require people to save for retirement. In other words, let Social Security cover the poverty protection angle while mandated savings cover the income replacement angle on top of that. Some states are soft coercing savings via so-called auto IRA plans. So are the United Kingdom and New Zealand. Australia outright requires both a provision of a workplace retirement plan and participation in that plan. That wasn't possible when Social Security started for a whole variety of reasons, but it is possible today, so let's just do it. When I've spoken to Republican members of Congress, they often respond that we don't like mandates. We don't want to mandate people to offer a retirement plan or automatically enroll in them, but they forget that payroll taxes aren't voluntary either. And if we don't do something to address retirement savings on the household side, it is a near certainty that we're going to end up raising payroll taxes on the Social Security side. So they need to choose one or the other. The combination of a government-funded safety net and universal workplace retirement savings isn't my own creation, but that's how we know it can work. Australia has had such a system for a generation, and as social insurance, it has worked. The median retiree in the US has a disposable income that's 65% higher than Australia. And in fact, the median US retiree has the highest disposable income in the world. But at the 10th percentile of distribution, US seniors have incomes 15% below Australians. Why not rejigger Social Security benefits to address that? And this is happening while Australia spends about 1/3 less on cash benefits for seniors than does the US. And Australia's expenditures will remain steady or even decline as Social Security costs go up. And yet the current Social Security benefit structure, with no minimum benefit but a high maximum benefit, is often treated as if it's sacred. The story is that Americans won't support a targeted benefit program. As they say, a program for the poor is a poor program. I think the subsequent growth of a wide variety of federal means-tested programs kind of disproves that dictum, but maybe we can put a finer point on the history of the Social Security benefit formula and why it differs from other Anglo countries. Back when Social Security was being considered, the 2 main committee chairs were Southerners who had fathers who fought in the Civil War, and not for the winning side, if you get my drift. At the time, the Jackson, Mississippi Daily News succinctly put it, quote, "The average Mississippian can't imagine himself chipping in to pay pensions for able-bodied Negroes to sit around in idleness on front galleries, supporting all their kinfolk on pensions, while cotton and corn crops are crying for workers to get them out of the grass." This helps explain why we have the Social Security benefit formula that we have. We don't have a universal flat benefit that even at the time existed in countries like the United Kingdom. I'm not sure why we should treat that approach as if it's sacred when we have reason to believe it's anything but. Now, my idea of a flat dollar benefit to all retirees coupled with universal retirement savings plans is enough to bring Social Security back to solvency in the long run, even at current payroll tax rates. It doesn't directly address the short-run solvency problem, but indirectly it does. Social Security's trustees project Social Security's unfunded obligation is equal to 1.2% of GDP over the next 75 years. Guess what's worth 1.3% of GDP according to the CBO? The federal tax preference for retirement savings, 58% of which flows to the richest quintile of households, but probably doesn't do very much to actually increase retirement savings. And guess what you don't really need once you've offered every American a workplace retirement plan and either auto-enrolled or mandatorily enrolled them in it. Really, people, this isn't that hard if you're willing to think out the box. And not very far outside the box either. It's just trying to think comprehensively about what we want Social Security to do in the context of our larger retirement system. To close, Grace Hopper, who was both a computer scientist and a Navy Rear Admiral, said, "The most dangerous phrase in the English language is, quote, 'we've always done it this way.'" Let's not let that be Social Security's epitaph. Thanks.
So I do have to fix one thing in my introduction. AARP is no longer the American Association for Retired People. We haven't been for almost 18 to 20 years. We dropped what it stood for because people over age 50 are not retired. So just wanted to point that out. One of the things I love about my job at AARP is I get to work on all of the different issues that affect people as they age. And I've worked on healthcare reform, on long-term care. And if you think about healthcare, I had doctors and nurses and insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies and hospitals and insurers all coming at me with their own particular sub-issue that affected them. We don't necessarily have that in Social Security. And so solving Social Security is in some ways deceptively easy. And I just want to talk a little bit of why it's maybe not as easy as we think, even though you've been hearing all kinds of a range of solutions. So first, I thought about doing some slides, and I'll tell you what the slide is, because I didn't get around to actually making them. So the first slide would be the equation for Social Security, and it's basically that tax revenues coming in, which is a percentage of the taxable payroll, have to be greater than or equal to the benefits being paid, which is the sum of a progressive earnings formula. You've heard PAAs thrown around by all of us. With reductions of claim by age, plus whatever's left in the trust fund, right? So we have a greater than equal than, simple math. But it's actually not that simple. You can't just cut benefits and raise taxes and everything is easy. And the reason that is because that both the system itself is a little bit more complicated than that easy equation that I could have wrote on a slide. And then people are more complicated. And so that's how I'm going to have most of my talk, is talking a little bit about the complexity of the system and a little bit about the complexity of real people. So first of all, and you heard Bill talk about this, there's many different types of beneficiaries within the program. And sometimes when we are mostly just talking about the retirement system, we don't really think about how one change on the retirement side over the typical worker can affect other populations. And so Bill reminded us this is an insurance program, that the benefit formula actually affects people who are disabled, children and other survivors. All of those things come into play. And I'll just give a specific example. For many years, there were ideas about how to help women in Social Security, because if you look at differences by gender, they're actually pretty significant. And so there was proposals by women's groups to have income sharing, or proposals to change from having a wife or spousal benefit to having a higher widow's benefit. And it wasn't actually until I'm looking at Karen and Melissa and Rich using the Dynasim model where we were actually able to say, wait a minute, if we did that, there's going to be all these divorced women that are going to be moved into poverty because we are thinking about the spouse as living in a house with a man who has a higher benefit, but we're not taking into consideration. So these intersections within the program are really important when you're designing changes to it. The other thing is people forget that there are many, many programs, and I think Mark asked a good question about SSI. And so a lot of the programmatic changes, which are good intention to help low-income beneficiaries, such as raising the special minimum or others, forget that that few extra dollars that they might get through their Social Security check may push them out of accessing benefits for things like food stamps or, importantly, SSI. And SSI is more than just money. It's Medicaid eligibility as well. And once you get Medicaid, not only is your out-of-pocket cost for healthcare done, but you have a whole range of additional services for long-term services and supports that Medicare doesn't provide. So again, when we're thinking about this program, good intention changes, we're going to help low-income people, can have disastrous consequences if we don't look at the program in its entirety, as well as all of the other things it fixes. I will agree with Karen that SSI needs updating, and we need to do a lot there too, so just as a side note. Other proposals assume that there is a range of data that Social Security doesn't have. And Jay may correct me because I haven't been at SSA for 25 years. But we don't have data on marriages. There's no national marriage registry. We don't have data necessarily in the SSA system about children. And so, well-intentioned ideas for child care credits really are hard to implement. AARP really cares a lot about family caregivers and the people that are taking care of older adults, where we know that there's huge burdens of care by the 38 million people that are trying to help out a loved one who also may have to drop out from work. So we would love to see if we have childcare, also caregiver credits, but again, we don't have a national registry of who's providing care. Hopefully, we will have more benefits like paid family leave, or AARP is pushing for a income tax credit, but again, that captures dollars given, not time out of the labor force. So again, structuring changes, no matter how they're well intended, really needs to take a broad view. The other point is that Social Security itself has been changed by external events. You've heard a lot today about both the changes in birth rates. You saw Peter's slides up there. You've heard about changes in life expectancy and earnings inequality. Those have had really major changes to the program and implications for the distribution of the program overall. I think we haven't come to grips fully in our conversations about what disparities in life expectancy are and what the implications. Right now, again, post-pandemic, life expectancy has fallen, but Native American life expectancy is age 65 in 2021. They're not even making it to the new retirement ages. So when we talk about changing retirement age and we don't look at the effect on particular populations, as Bill talked about, we're missing a huge point. Socioeconomic status, we've heard as well. So the top 1% of men live 15 years longer than the bottom 1% of men. Women, it's about a decade. So that's 15 more years of benefits, or a decade for women. And that has radically changed the progressivity of Social Security. You heard Peter, and I actually have forgotten that he wrote the National Academy of Science report several years ago, but it found that the top 20% of beneficiaries, or the top 20% of earners, get more than $100,000 in benefits more than the bottom 20% of beneficiaries just because of the differences in life expectancy. Again, 10 more years of benefits, you're going to get a lot more totally. Rising inequities in earnings have also been a key driver of the long-term problems in Social Security. You heard that from Louise today. I just whispered with Kathleen, and if they had put automatic stabilizers to cover 80% or 90% of covered earnings back in the 1983 amendments, it would have made the program solvent to 2075. So this change in how people are getting paid and the lack of equity around earnings growth has made a huge impact on Social Security. Now, the final and probably most important point from my perspective is we're talking about the program as if it doesn't involve people. And as if people don't have things more going on to them than their Social Security check. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how it affects real people's lives. And real people take this very seriously. A recent poll from the AP NORC showed that almost 80% of respondents oppose reducing the size of Social Security benefits because they value them so much. And a poll that we did last December showed that 82% of people in their 50 to 64 and 84% of people age 65 and over think that the issue of Social Security, the issue of whether Social Security will be there for current and future retirees is one of the biggest problems facing our country. So real people are concerned about this. They know how important those checks are to them. And so we know that even without any changes right now, the system itself has become has been changing with the automatic increases of the retirement age from 65 to 67. That's been a decline in benefits by roughly 12%. And you saw that Jay showed that's changed behavior. So people are claiming a year later. It means they're missing out on 1 year's worth of checks. So this is a real cost to people. The other thing we have to think about is people, when they get their checks, has the Medicare premium taken out of it for most people. And so what they see is the net amount of their Social Security, net without these healthcare costs. But premiums are only one part of what people pay. They also pay co-payments, other types of payments. And my team just put out a report showing that on average, the annual cost that somebody pays for premiums and medical services is over $6,000 a year. So remember, Social Security benefits on average are only $20,000 a year. So it's a growing share of your Social Security check that is just going towards your healthcare costs. We had Kaiser Family Foundation actually look at this and project it in the future. And by 2030, again, for oldest beneficiaries who have long-term care costs as well, 87 cents of every dollar of their Social Security check will be eaten up by healthcare costs and long-term care costs by the time you're 80. It's really hard to live on 13 cents of Social Security. And we see housing costs increase, and these are the things that I hear about when I talk to real people. The other thing is that Social Security is just one factor in people's lives. The other slide I was going to put up is the 80,000 people in France protesting the increase in the retirement age there from 62 to 64, which sounds, very reasonable compared to what we're talking about. And I think that's not just because they're French and they like to protest. I think it's also because the government did this in isolation, right? So they're saying you have to work longer, but they didn't do anything for the demand for older workers, right? We know that people face all kinds of problems that they can't work after a certain point due to health issues or because their jobs are physically demanding. We're working with the National Academy of Social Insurance even to look at the US system to say how can we not harm disability but really address those people. Age discrimination is real, and it's huge, and it's increasing during the pandemic. We surveyed people in 2020, found that 78% of older workers either saw or experienced age discrimination at work. And while the US has somewhat strong age discrimination laws, they need to be stronger, it's still a huge problem. In fact, Karen's colleague, Rich Johnson at the Urban Institute, showed that half of all people in their 50s lose their job involuntarily at some point. So I don't know how many, I'm just looking around the room, quite a few of us are over age 50. Half of us will lose our jobs, maybe not in this room, in our 50s, and only 10% of us will actually get a job that pays the same when we go back to work. So we're not making sure that there's a demand for older workers. We're also not making sure that people have training and skills that they need. UK, I know my time is going up. So UK had a really interesting recent returnship and apprentice program that they're trying to think about these issues. At AARP, we're working with OECD and the World Economic Forums on a project called Living, Learning, and Earning Longer to try and get employers to think about the multi-generational workforce and think about how we can extend on the demand side the careers of people who want or need to work longer. Lastly, and Andrew touched on this, I don't think Social Security is the only thing that we need to fix to make sure that people have a secure retirement. We still have 40% of people relying more than half of their income on Social Security. A piece of that is half of our labor force doesn't have a way to save through their paycheck. And half probably don't get the tax incentives that we have to save, as Andrew talked about, are very skewed. So we've been working state by state by state in order to pass what we call work and save laws. California has one of the first that's really functioning well. There are 8 other state plans that are operating. 7 states have legislation, and another 30 states are looking at it. So this idea that we need to offer workers whose employers don't have a retirement plan a way to do it through pooled resources is really taking storm, and mostly because workers want it, and even in red states, business owners want somebody else to take on that responsibility. But even if we do the best we can on retirement savings, Social Security, in my mind, still is better. It provides longevity insurance, inflation, disability, survivor, and a whole range of protections that retirement savings itself will never do. So, in closing, I don't have a good song lyric. I tried to think of what I could say while I was there, but let me just say it's not just a simple math equation, even though I'm here at the Stanford economics program. We really need to look at how any idea, good, bad, otherwise, is going to change the entire program and interact with other programs that people get. And more importantly, we need to think of it from the individual's standpoint and all of the different things that they're facing in retirement. There are so many things that need to fix. I have full employment probably for quite a few more years. But I guess I am firmly, and I think you've heard unanimously, we need to fix Social Security now, because the longer we wait, both the harder it is and the more uncertainty people have in their future. So I'm with John. I like it fix it late rather than later is my proposal for fixing Social Security. So thank you.
So I'm going to ask a few questions. My suggestion is you answer them briefly, because you can get even better questions from the audience. So I'll try to turn it over to the audience so you guys can ask the good questions. In our first one is for Deb. In our pre-meeting, you mentioned that AARP had a set of principles for Social Security reform, and I don't know that you have to go through all of them, but could you maybe highlight 1 or 2 of the top ones? There also is the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They have a set of principles, and you said, well, ours are a little different. So just elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. I'm not going to read all 8 principles. That would bore you to tears. They are on our website. I'll just say the difference is the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget is focused on the federal budget. AARP is focused on individuals. Our highest order of principles is that we want to make the program solvent and adequate for future generations. And so if I looked even at the paper of principles that Andrew and Gopi put out for today's event, most of them we agree with. But solvency shouldn't just be the goal. We also need adequacy. People need to have a benefit that they can actually live on. So we have a range of other particular proposals that maintain Social Security's current character, protects the people that are most in need, rewards work, and ensures fairness. So.
In our pre-meeting also, this is to both of you, traditionally people think, wow, there's two ways to fix this program. One is to cut the benefits and the other is to raise taxes. Now, Andrew, you have a new way of thinking about it, which was very interesting. But what I heard from both of you is that if we had fixed this on a timely basis, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, we might have had a combination of benefit cuts and tax increases. But as we've delayed, the chances of benefit cuts has been lowered, and the chances of tax increases has been increased. And I just thought maybe you could elaborate briefly on that, or if I didn't get it right, tell me. Andrew, why don't you start off?
I think you have it right. The basic math is, people do care about their own self-interest, and if you're a baby boomer paying your taxes into the program, you might care about your taxes. If you're now 20 years later a baby boomer collecting benefits on it, you collect more, you care more about your benefits. So I think that was inevitable. That as the population aged, political voting preferences would reflect that. You have less time to make these benefit changes. If we had done something 20 years ago, you could have transitioned changes in to make the system solvent. Now it's very difficult to do that on the benefit side. But I think you just see that reflected in the politics as well. I mean, seniors are a Republican-heavy group now, so Republicans in particular have this conflict. They don't want to raise taxes. They also don't want to offend their voting group, and they're trying to figure out how to do it. But I think on that end, clearly it has shifted more towards a revenue solution than a benefit cut solution.
And I'll just say, if you look at those charts of what happened in '83, there was a very small initial deficit. With the end of the trust fund, there'll be a very large one. And in 2035, you can't cut benefits for people who are, it is very hard. And again, you'd see lots of protests if you cut benefits for people that were in current retirement. So what are you going to do in 2035, 2036, 2037 if you can't cut benefits? You have to either raise taxes or use general revenue transfers for those early years. Long-term solutions, I think, open up more possibilities, but short-term solutions of how are you going to pay those checks in the first couple decades, or at least the first generation, make it really hard to do on the benefit side.
My next question is actually a variant of one Mark asked. What if we don't cut benefits and we don't raise taxes, and somehow we just get the government, the general federal government, to pick up the shortfall for Social Security? We just borrow the money. Two questions. Is that a likely outcome, and is that a desirable outcome?
You want to go first, Deb?
I don't think it's a likely long-term. I hope reasonable people can sit together and make reasonable compromises. That's what we're calling for, and that it needs to be done as soon as possible. How much general revenue, I think, will depend on how soon the changes are made. But I don't think that will be the only solution to Social Security.
I guess what I'd say is, if you remember Louise's presentation from this morning, she pointed out that the continued payment of full scheduled benefits is built into the CBO baseline for budgets and debt for the whole federal government. So in a sense, any change we would make to make Social Security solvent, raising taxes or cutting benefits, will reduce unified budget deficits. So you could say, well, just stick with the baseline and general revenue finance it or whatever we want to do. The problem is what CBO presents is an unsustainable baseline, that it's not something, where debt is ever increasing. Moreover, if you essentially exempt Social Security from fixing any of that structural deficit, it means all of it has to get resolved either essentially on Medicare or on the on-budget side, which I think is going to be very, very difficult to do. So, in theory, you can do it in the short term and maybe as a transition, but the worrying part is as poor as we're being at fixing Social Security, we've got a whole range of other problems to fix. And I'm worrying about how all this stuff comes together.
Okay, my final question is, say you're thinking about or know somebody who's 55 years old, they're working, they plan on retiring in 12 years at 67, the so-called normal retirement age, but they also hear that the trust fund's going to be exhausted exactly on the day they retire. What should they be thinking about? How much should they be counting on? How would you evaluate their problem of whether they're going to get what the current law says, or they're going to get less, or it just seems like they're dealing in a world of uncertainty?
Well, I think you're referring pretty specifically to me. Like, really specifically to me. I honestly don't worry about it at all. I mean, I'm a person who advocates for benefit cuts, and still I don't worry about benefit cuts. It's the closer you get to it, the less likely it is you're going to have your benefits cut. I worked in the Bush White House, and at the time he said nobody age 55 and over will be affected, and the policies have shifted to the left since then. So it's just not. It is a big. Social Security insolvency is a big problem, but it's much more a problem for the federal budget and for all the other things you want government to do than it is a problem for the retirees themselves. I actually feel personally very safe in my benefits.
All right, so I won't be a Debbie Downer, but I'm 53, so you're talking about me too. And I think it is a problem that we haven't made any changes since I was in junior high. The conversation about Social Security going bankrupt undermines people's belief. They don't understand that bankrupt, and I hate that word. We did a thing with the National Press Foundation trying to get the researchers to all repeat, it is not going bankrupt, there is a shortfall. So just the conversation around it is a problem, and you wrote a great paper recently that talked about the price of this uncertainty in people making their plans, because people will either save too much or save too little. And it's not just me that I'm worried about. Actually, I agree with Andrew. I'm less worried about me. I've got kids in their 20s. I want them to be able to plan and understand what they have to do in order to get their financial life in order. So I think your paper said it was about 2 months of salary, the cost of uncertainty, but maybe you can share with the group exactly what the numbers were.
I'm not sure I'm prepared to tell you exactly what the numbers are, but I do think there's an additional cost of the uncertainty, and that people that are trying to plan their lives, maybe even in a life cycle type model, it's unnecessary uncertainty. That is, if Congress decided what they're going to do in 2035 and announced it now, people would be better off than waiting for 12 years to figure out what they're going to do.
John, could I just touch on that quickly, though?
Yeah.
I think there's an important point that if Congress was going, if Congress knew how it was going to resolve Social Security, they had a secret agreement, and it was all signed in some back room, clearly you would like to know sooner rather than later.
Right.
What we have had, though, is, let's say beginning 1984, we knew then the system was going back into deficits. Imagine if we had just gradually increased the payroll tax as needed in order to keep the system solvent for the long term. Somebody, medium wage worker retiring 2034 would have paid an extra $100,000 or so in payroll taxes. Somebody at the tax max would have paid over $300,000 in additional payroll taxes. Had we done that back then, Those people are not going to get their benefits cut. They massively benefited financially by deferring reform. So there's the uncertainty part you're getting at, and yet the delay in reforming Social Security has unequivocally benefited people who weren't forced to share in that cost, whether it's tax increases or benefit cuts, and that's shifted the cost more to people in the future. It's a fixed cost to the funding shortfall, 23 trillion or whatever it is. The more people we exempt by delaying it, the worse it is for people in the future, and that's their cost. I see it.
The baby boom generation is going to escape without paying much of the cost. Once you're my student, you're always going to be my helper. So Gopi's going to call on people. You may or may not know, but I have really terrible eyesight, so I probably couldn't see you waving your hand. And she also now can take responsibility for telling us when this session has to end.
Yes. We have about 10 more minutes for questions, so let's start right here.
So I've been listening to this discussion, and I am really confused, because if you ask me what the goals of Social Security are, I could not tell you. And I don't know how we can make policy recommendations if we can't clearly articulate what the goals are.
You're fully qualified to be a member of Congress because they can't really explain it either. I mean, you could look in a textbook, but I think things like preventing destitution in old age, it might be poverty or however you want to define it, that's one. Providing assistance to people who are too poor to save on their own or who have some bad experience that would harm them. The second is forcing people to save for retirement over and above that amount. You have people who would lack the foresight to do that, and they might fall back relying on the taxpayer, and so you're insuring other people against that risk. And third, you have the annuitization, preventing people from outliving their assets. So I look at that and I say, okay, how do we want to solve that? And that's a slightly distinct question from how do we make Social Security, the program, solvent. And so I was just trying to get at these larger goals and saying there's more than one way to skin the cat.
And I'll just add, I mean, the title of the program is Old Age Survivors Disability Insurance. So we are purchasing an insurance policy that will protect us whether we become disabled in our from work, whether or not our loved ones pass away. So it's more than just a retirement savings program. It provides all kinds of things. And the insurance is also protection against longevity risks, so that some people may live much more years than they had been able to save for. And also inflation risk, which is huge at the moment.
Why don't we go back here with question.
Thank you. Since this panel is about political economy, I wanted to ask more about the political landscape right now for Social Security. Earlier it was said that we had a thick middle during the Reagan administration that now has evaporated, but then Andrew mentioned that there's a surprising amount of overlap between the populist right and progressive left on Social Security. So it's obvious that polarization is a problem, but when it comes to Social Security specifically, which landscape are we dealing with? Do we have a thick middle that's just waiting for a crisis to take action, or have we actually lost a center that can help deliver reform? And then related to that, Peter said that unfortunately the academic community, he doesn't think has much influence over polarization. So I was curious if you could weigh in on what the academic community can do to improve polarization on this issue, but also more generally.
Great questions. We used to have, and we've had since the Greenspan Commission, many commissions that get together in a bipartisan way. Those have never been moved through Congress. The voting rules for Social Security is a supermajority of 60, which forces bipartisanship, which I think is actually a really good thing. I think you don't want a program to go 50 years without making changes. You probably also don't want changes every year. That's also very hard to plan for. We've seen bills on from both parties. One party's bill will be all benefit cuts. One party's bill will be all tax increases. I think there's groups of bipartisanship that are trying to form to create plans that reach a broader consensus. Whether they can get, any plan can get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate today, or what it needs in the House is very difficult.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's if we might have once had a sort of a normally distributed sort of political orientation of our elected officials, now we have an abnormally distributed, sort of bimodal distribution. To what degree that's reflected in Americans' political attitudes? I think to a certain degree it is, but I think Americans still have a lump in the middle. But it's just very, very difficult given the general polarization in Congress. There's also, you know, as Deb said, there's these thresholds. You have to have the House. You have to have 60 votes in the Senate. You have to have the presidency. That's going to be very, very tough to do. It is, and you know, there's a whole variety of reasons for the dealing with how our political structures are set up. But you know, other countries have solved these things. The fact that we've gone 40 years knowing we have the problem and literally done nothing is, I just really think it's a sort of a, you know, a damning, you know, commentary on the governance we have. You know, this is everything. Oh, this is a sacred trust. It's essential for this, that, and the other. Like, and year after year, you do nothing. So it's, you know, people have a right to be a little bit ticked off about it, I think.
In preview for the next session, Jason and Kathleen are going to talk about a lot of the different proposals that are out there.
Great, we have a question right here, Karen.
Thank you. This question's for Andrew. Can you talk about the merits and or issues about taxing investment income and having some of those proceeds go into the trust fund?
I'm not opposed to just general revenue financing of Social Security. I talked a bit about like sort of the Australia and New Zealand system, which is these sort of flat dollar benefits, and those are general revenue financed. I don't have any problems with that. Where things get confused is, you know, on the one hand, you have the rhetoric surrounding Social Security. These are earned benefits, so on and so forth. Well, the problem isn't, you know, we may have earned the benefits. The problem is we didn't pay for them. I mean, if we'd all paid for them, the system would be going broke. But then the solutions are things that undercut the argument this is an earned benefit. I was looking at investment income, essentially going, you know, lifting the payroll tax ceiling, things like that. So as policy, I don't have a problem. I think it's just, and on the economic side, I don't have a strong opinion on whether going after investment income has economic costs that taxing wages doesn't. It's part of this, I just want something that makes some sense here. And we have a very incoherent way of thinking about the system, very incoherent policy discussions. So I'm not against it as such, but I think we just got to realize what are we trying to accomplish here, basically.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So right here.
So I wanted to posit sort of an extension to, I think, John's question, which is, let's say like someone's not 55, they're 45 or 35, and I think a question sort of I get a lot is, how should I think about this when I'm planning for retirement? Like, should I, how much money should I assume that I could receive from such a system if I were, collecting in 40 years or 45 years? And I guess my question is, how do you guys think about this problem?
If I were you, I would look at the funding gap for Social Security. Let's say it's 2-3% of payroll. Increase the savings in your 401k by 2 or 3% of payroll. If we end up raising taxes, in 2034 by 2 or 3% of payroll in order to pay higher benefits, then you reduce your savings by that. That's a way of sort of trying to hedge that risk. Obviously the younger you are, the bigger the uncertainty, but at the same time, you have tons of time to prepare. So I would just save a little bit more, and I think that kind of takes care of it. If you're a middle-class person, if we're thinking about the insurance aspect and the risks, then all bets are off.
We might have time for one more question. John, did you have something to say?
No.
Okay. Back here.
Wanted to react to something that Debra said about it's not only the system, but you got to think about the people, and you got to look at things broadly. So you might be doing this already. I have faith in each of you. My question is, have you ever encountered folks in the organization, maybe not your organization, but others, saying, that's not my department? And I think that that's just something that to remember as far as when we're trying to have confidence in the system, in the systems. And I'll say that maybe AI is going to help out, and it wouldn't be a first half of 2023 conference without a reference to that. But if that's going to be used, don't screw it up. And if you have other organizations you talk with, just remember, if you're already doing it, to have them, as far as the culture of the organization and maybe the organizational values, to really avoid saying, that's not my department, that's not my job.
Mm-hmm. One possibility, this is a little speculative, but to the extent that AI machines, call them that, and robots are going to do a lot of work, maybe the owners of those should pay into the system.
Well, with that, I think we'll end this session. And thank you very much.